They told me at the post office that I had moved to Florida. Me, a woman who hasn't left this town in 17 years, who still folds her grocery bags for reuse and keeps the same cracked ceramic mug by the sink as if it were a living companion. Your address was changed 2 years ago, the clerk said, tapping her keyboard the way you'd tap the shoulder of a child pretending to sleep. And there I stood, 81 years old, clutching my little blue purse against my ribs, staring at her as if she'd just told me I'd sprouted wings. Florida. I wouldn't survive a week in that heat. I barely survived summer here. I laughed at first, a thin, trembling laugh, the kind that comes from a place where disbelief and dread crowd together. "Ma'am," she said gently, as though speaking to someone whose mind had loosened, "you filed the change yourself." She turned the monitor so I could see it. A form with my name, my date of birth, my old address scratched through and replaced with a sunny little P.O. box number somewhere outside Tampa. A wobbly, oversized signature at the bottom, a clumsy imitation of mine, like a ghost trying on my handwriting. I felt my cheeks flush hot, not with embarrassment, but with something else, something slow and thick that started in my chest and spread outward until I could hardly feel my legs beneath me. For a moment, I truly thought I might faint right there against the counter, the line behind me growing, strangers sighing with impatience, and the clerk holding her breath the way people do around the elderly, waiting to see if we'll break. I told her I never signed anything. My voice shook, which angered me, because I didn't want to give the world the satisfaction of seeing how easily older women can be dismissed when we tremble. She asked whether someone in my family might have handled it on my behalf. My family. I could almost hear the word echo in that sterile blue and white room, not like an accusation, but like a test I already knew I was failing. I told her no. I told her again. She watched me with that mixture of sympathy and skepticism that young people reserve for the old, as if age itself were an alibi for confusion. She printed out the form anyway, sliding it across the counter with a softness meant to soothe. And then I saw it, below the forged signature, a scrawled notation. Grandson confirmed identity, his name, his number. My heart didn't drop. It didn't leap. It simply folded quietly, like a bird tucking its wing under after being struck. I walked home slower than usual, not because my legs hurt more than they normally do, but because something in me felt unanchored, like I might float up and drift off if I moved too quickly. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of damp leaves and last night's rain, and each house on my street seemed suddenly unfamiliar, as though I were seeing it all from far away. When I reached my porch and fumbled with the key that always sticks no matter how much oil I use, I felt the silence of the house swallow me as soon as I stepped inside. It was a silence I used to cherish. The silence of no footsteps, no demands, no one calling my name unless they needed something. But that afternoon, it settled on my shoulders like a heavy, wet blanket, making it hard to breathe. I sat at the kitchen table, the one my husband refinished himself 43 years ago, and I let the printed form rest in front of me, my name, my birthday, my life, and his handwriting, sloppy and loud, like he never learned how to keep a secret even when he thought he was clever. For 2 years, the checks meant for me, small amounts, modest, but mine, had been rerouted to a place I had never heard of. For 2 years, someone had been signing my name, cashing what belonged to me, moving through the world with an ease I had earned and he had not. And all that time, I thought the mail had simply slowed down. I thought the government was behind. I thought maybe the world had become forgetful of old women like me. I didn't know the forgetting had started in my own family. I tried to remember the last time he visited, 8, maybe 9 months ago. He came late in the evening, smelling faintly of gasoline and fast food, eyes darting everywhere except my face. He asked how I'd been, but in that tone people use when they don't want a real answer. He opened my fridge without asking, took a soda, left the can half drunk on the counter, said he had to run. I remember thanking him just for stopping by. I remember feeling grateful for those 10 rushed minutes, as if they were a luxury. How the lace curtains I'd sewn myself decades ago fluttered slightly in the draft, as if they too were unsettled. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, confidently, unaware that something in my life had just cracked. I stared at my hands. They looked the same as always, thin, veined, the skin loose at the wrists, but they felt different, as though they belonged to a woman I was only just meeting. A woman who wasn't as naive as her family wished she'd be. A woman who understood, with a cold clarity, that the people we raise don't always grow into the people we prayed they'd become. I must have sat there for over an hour, the afternoon light shifting across the table, turning gold, then fading. At one point I reached for my phone, thinking I would call him, not to accuse, not to scold, but simply to ask why. But I couldn't bring myself to. I realized that whatever answer he offered would be worse than silence. If he lied, it meant he thought I was still gullible. If he told the truth, it meant he believed I was disposable. I couldn't bear either. So I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting the weight of the discovery settle into me, the way dust settles onto unused shelves. Quietly, inevitably, with a finality that leaves no part untouched. And as the room grew darker, as the house creaked and settled around me, I understood that this wasn't just a bureaucratic mistake or a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, older, something that had been building for years, hidden beneath little dismissals, small indifferences, subtle cruelties that I had brushed aside, because that is what mothers and grandmothers do. We excuse, we soften, we forgive before apologies are even formed. But sitting there with that forged form glowing faintly under the lamp, I knew that whatever life I had before that moment was gone. Something had shifted, something quiet but irreversible. And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt the faint, unfamiliar stir of anger. Not wild, not loud, but steady, purposeful, almost warm. The kind of anger that doesn't destroy you, but wakes you up. The kind that tells you you've been asleep far too long. I wish I could tell you that the truth came gently, that it arrived with some soft explanation, a moment of clarity delivered by someone who cared enough to soften the blow. But the truth rarely behaves that kindly in the lives of women my age. It arrives fast, sharp, like a drawer you forgot to close catching your hip in the dark, and you stand there stunned, your hand on the bruise, wondering why you didn't see it coming. The day after the post office incident, I went to the social services building because the clerk there had suggested I speak to someone about the checks that had apparently been redirected. And even the way she said apparently carried a kind of pity that made my stomach twist. I walked into that gray building with its flickering overhead lights and the faint smell of old carpet, clutching the printout of the forged change of address form, determined not to let anyone mistake me for a confused old woman who had wandered in, looking for lost memories. The young man at the reception window didn't even look up at first. He asked for my ID in a monotone that suggested he had long since stopped being surprised by anything. But when he finally glanced at the document and then at me, something in his expression shifted. I watched people come and go, mothers with strollers, men with clipboards, tired workers from night shifts clutching forms as though the paper itself could save them. When the young man returned, he asked me to follow him to a small room with a door that didn't quite close properly, and there another woman sat waiting, older than him, but younger than me, with the kind of steady gaze that made me feel, for the first time in this whole ordeal, that someone was actually seeing me instead of seeing a stereotype. She took the form, examined it with the precision of someone accustomed to deception, and asked if I had filed any change of address in the past 2 years. I told her no. She nodded slowly, then pulled up my file on her computer, and I watched her brows tighten as line after line appeared on the screen. Each record a quiet betrayal I hadn't known was happening. According to their system, I had been receiving benefits. Nothing extravagant, nothing beyond what a lifetime of tax-paying and caregiving had earned me. But those benefits had been cashed or deposited somewhere far from my home. She asked if I had family who might have helped manage my mail. I hesitated, because even then, even after everything, there was a part of me that wanted to protect him, the boy I had once fed with a spoon, the boy whose fever I had soothed with cool cloths, the boy whose school plays I never missed, whose crumpled drawings I taped to my fridge for years, even after he forgot they existed. I told her I had a grandson. She asked his name, and when I said it aloud, hearing it echo in that small, fluorescent-lit room, I felt something in my throat tighten. She typed it into the system, and then, with a strange gentleness, asked if I knew he had been accessing my funds. I didn't answer immediately. The silence in that room thickened, pressing against my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and stubborn, like a reminder that I was still here, that my life had not yet been erased completely. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded smaller than I expected, but it didn't shake. I told her I hadn't known, that no one had told me, that I still opened my mailbox every week expecting envelopes that never came. She showed me a series of scanned signatures, each one sloppier than the last, each one pretending to be mine. She asked if I recognized them. I looked at the screen for a long time, long enough that the letters blurred slightly, and I remembered the way he used to hold a pen as a child, his fingers tense, his wrists stiff, always pressing too hard. The signatures looked just like that, heavy, forced, impatient. I told her no, they were not mine. She looked at me then, with a mixture of sympathy and indignation on my behalf, a rare blend that made me feel strangely validated, as though she were carrying some of the weight I had been holding alone. She explained that if someone had submitted a false change of address request and had been signing for my benefits, this constituted a federal offense. She said the words carefully, watching me closely, as if afraid they might shatter me, but I didn't break. Instead, I felt a slow, rising warmth in my chest, not the burning of shame or fear, but the burn of recognition, the recognition that the betrayal was not imagined or exaggerated, that I was not, as the world likes to insist elderly women often are, confused or forgetful or lost. No, I had been robbed, quietly, methodically, intentionally. She printed copies of the suspicious transactions and placed them gently in front of me, and I looked at the record of 2 years' worth of theft, each date like a small cut, each amount like a bruise forming beneath the skin. She advised me to contact the postal inspectors, and when she said it, something in her voice told me that she did not expect me to do it, that many people in my situation didn't, that they were too tired, too afraid of conflict, too afraid of damaging what little family they had left. But I surprised her. I surprised myself. I asked for the number, wrote it down carefully, tucked it into my purse alongside the grocery lists and old receipts that marked the quiet routines of my days. She placed her hand lightly on my wrist, just for a moment, a gesture that was not pity, but solidarity, and told me that I had done the right thing coming in. I thanked her and walked out of that office with my shoulders straighter than when I'd entered, though my heart felt heavy enough to anchor me to the earth. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the passing streets, the rows of modest houses, the cracked sidewalks where children used to ride their bikes, but rarely do anymore. Everything looked the same as always, yet nothing felt the same. I kept seeing his face, not as he is now, taller, older, with that restlessness that never seems to leave him, but as he was when he was small, when he would sit on my lap and lean his head against my chest, trusting me with everything he didn't have words for yet. How strange that trust can flow so freely from child to adult, but not the other way around. As I stepped off the bus and walked the last few blocks to my house, the wind tugged at my coat, and the late afternoon sun cast a pale glow over the quiet street. I felt tired, not in the way that sleep could fix, but in the way that comes from realizing the people you loved most have been living whole secret lives built on your silence. When I reached my porch and turned the key in the stubborn lock, I knew something irreversible had begun. The catalyst wasn't dramatic or loud. It wasn't a confrontation or a confession or a shouted argument across a kitchen table. It was a printed form, a forged signature, a federal record of theft, and the undeniable truth that someone I loved had looked at my life, my small, modest life, and decided it was his to harvest. And once you see that clearly, once the curtain is pulled back, you cannot unsee it. Something shifts permanently, like a bone setting wrong after a break. You learn, painfully and slowly, that the people you raised can grow into strangers, and sometimes those strangers are willing to carve pieces out of you without ever looking you in the eye. I wish I could say that after leaving the social services office, I sprang into action with fiery resolve, marching straight towards some clean and righteous confrontation. But that would be a lie, because the truth is that the days immediately following the discovery unfolded in a kind of thick hush, the kind that settles over a house after someone has died, even though no one in my life had died yet, except perhaps the version of me that had trusted without hesitation. I moved through those days like a woman underwater, aware of the world but removed from it, watching everything blur slightly at the edges, as if even reality had grown reluctant to look at me directly. I kept waking up earlier than usual, not because I had something to do, but because the quiet hours before dawn were the only ones that didn't feel heavy with questions. I would sit at the kitchen table with my mug of tea, tracing the rim with my finger while the house exhaled old wooden sighs, and I would find myself trying to remember when exactly things had begun to shift, when the ground had started to tip just enough for me not to notice it until it became a slope. It wasn't that the betrayal grew louder or more violent during that time. No, the cruelty of it was that it became quieter, more insidious, like a draft slipping under a door you thought was sealed. Little things kept revealing themselves, not in dramatic bursts, but in subtle, almost tender ways, like the universe was trying to show me the truth with gentle taps rather than brute force, though the effect was no less devastating. One morning I went to the mailbox out of habit, opened it, and found it nearly empty except for a glossy advertisement and a utility bill that had been delayed. I stood there holding the cold metal edge of the box, realizing that I had not seen a personal letter, a handwritten card, or even one of those generic holiday mailers from the family in years. And I tried to remember when that absence had started to feel normal. Another afternoon, I opened the small drawer where I keep receipts and statements, and as I sorted through them, I noticed that there had been no annual benefit adjustment letters for 2 years, none of the small notices that used to arrive. Predictably, like clockwork, reminding me that even though I lived a quiet life, I was still part of some larger system that acknowledged my existence. But the real escalation came not from papers or mail, but from the slow unraveling of memory, not my own, but the memories I had pushed aside to protect the people I loved. I began to recall moments that had seemed harmless at the time. The day my grandson asked for my spare house key in case of emergencies, and brushed away my hesitation with a smile. The afternoon he came over and insisted on helping me sort through my mail, saying the envelopes were confusing and he'd take care of the important ones. The evening he told me he'd updated my contact information with the clinic because they always call you at the wrong hours. And I remember thinking how considerate that was. Each memory floated back into my mind like debris rising to the surface of a lake, bits and pieces of a truth I had been too willing to bury under my affection for him. I saw now how easily I had handed him pieces of my independence, not because he asked with force, but because he asked with a tenderness I wanted to believe was genuine. And maybe some part of it was, which somehow made it worse, because cruelty born from indifference is easier to process than cruelty performed by someone who once kissed your cheek goodnight with unself-conscious love. I found myself murmuring aloud to the empty house, asking questions that had no answers, not because I expected anyone to hear, but because saying them softened the ache of carrying them alone. At night, lying in my narrow bed, I would stare at the ceiling and listen to the faint ticking of the hallway clock. Each tick a reminder that time continued without asking whether I was ready to face another day. The shadows on the walls would shift as the streetlights flickered, and I would find myself thinking about the years I had spent working late shifts, saving carefully, doing everything I was taught to do in a world that gives women like me very little room to make mistakes. I would remember the sacrifices that had built the small life I lived, the quiet victories that no one celebrated, paying off the mortgage, nursing my husband through illness, raising my daughter alone after he passed, and later helping raise her son when she couldn't manage the weight of motherhood. All of that effort, all of that love, condensed into a lifetime of service, and now somehow it had all been funneled into a distant postal box in Florida, siphoned away by someone who had once clung to my skirt when he was frightened. And still, I didn't confront him. Not yet. That was the strange part, the part that surprised even me. The escalation wasn't marked by anger or shouting or demands. It was marked instead by my deepening awareness of how invisible I had become to the boy I once held like something sacred. He didn't call. He didn't visit. He didn't send a single message, which made me wonder if he already sensed that the walls were shifting, that the scaffolding of lies he had leaned on might be starting to crack. There was one afternoon, I pulled out a small metal box where I keep old family photographs and letters, and I sat on the living room floor, going through them slowly, letting myself feel the weight of each scrap of paper. There were photos of him as a child, laughing with gaps in his teeth, holding the toy trucks I had saved up to buy him. There were birthday cards he'd made in school, with crooked hearts and misspelled words. There were notes he'd written when he was older, quick and careless, but affectionate enough to keep me believing that we still shared something real. I held them and felt a strange mixture of grief and tenderness, as if I were mourning someone who had died, even though he still walked this earth. The first escalation was not a dramatic eruption, but a quiet deepening, a recognition that something foundational had shifted inside me. It was the slow realization that trust, once cracked, never returns to its original shape. It was the understanding that the world I had inhabited, a world where my grandson loved me simply because I was his grandmother, no longer existed, if it ever had. And as that realization settled into me, as the days grew longer and the air colder, I felt something else settle too. A steady, simmering resolve, not yet action, not yet confrontation, but the kind of resolve that grows roots quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it will rise. In the days that followed, something in me shifted so quietly, I almost didn't notice it at first. Like the way a house settles after decades of standing in the same place, groaning in the bones of its wood, adjusting to the truth of its own weight. I had lived for so long in a posture of apology, shrinking myself so others could feel large, asking for nothing so others could give nothing without shame, that when the shift finally came, it felt less like rebellion and more like remembering a language I had once spoken fluently, Iki. The moment itself was small, almost embarrassingly ordinary, but I've learned that change seldom arrives with trumpets. It arrives in the whisper of a hinge, the break of a habit, the simple act of refusing to sit where someone else tells you to sit. It started with a phone call I didn't answer. The phone rang in the late morning, that bright, sharp sound slicing through the quiet of my kitchen as I stood by the window rinsing apples, and without thinking, I wiped my hands on a towel and walked toward the receiver. But when I saw his name glowing on the screen, something in my chest tightened, not with fear or sorrow, but with a strange, calm certainty that whatever he wanted, it wasn't for my sake. I watched the phone vibrate in my palm until it stopped, and then I set it down gently on the counter, as if placing a fragile object I had no intention of touching again. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was simply the understanding that answering him would pull me back into a role I no longer wished to play, the role of the grateful, quiet grandmother who accepted whatever crumbs of attention were offered to her. Later that same afternoon, I walked to the post office again, not because I expected any miraculous clarity, but because the air outside felt crisp enough to clear the fog inside my head. The woman who had helped me earlier recognized me, and there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, an acknowledgement that older women who walk into government buildings alone are usually carrying burdens no one sees. She handed me a brochure about reporting mail fraud, her voice low, almost apologetic, and as she spoke, I felt an odd sense of steadiness settle into me. I hadn't come for advice, not consciously, but her words, simple, procedural, practical, landed deep inside me like seeds finding a patch of soil. I realized that for the first time in years, someone was treating me as a person capable of action, not as someone who needed decisions made for her. And the feeling of that, of being recognized, not pitied, sent a warmth through my chest that was almost painful. Walking home, I passed the small park near my street, the one with the faded benches where teenagers used to smoke while pretending they were invisible. The trees were losing their leaves, dropping them slowly and without regret, and as I watched the wind scatter them across the path, it struck me how effortless letting go seemed for things that never questioned their right to stand where they stood. I sat on one of the benches for a long while, listening to the distant sound of traffic and the faint clatter of a dog's leash, and I tried to imagine what my life might look like if I stopped clinging to the old version of my grandson, the one who existed only in memory and hope. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I simply allowed the thought to settle without resistance, and to my surprise, it did not break me. It steadied me. That evening, I took out my small file folder, the one where I keep important papers, and laid everything on the table, the forged forms, the benefit statements, the printouts the social services officer had given me. I lined them up carefully, not with the frantic desperation of someone trying to undo the past, but with the methodical calm of someone preparing to see things clearly at last. As I read through each document, tracing the dates with my fingertip, I felt a peculiar sensation, as though I were sifting through evidence not just of fraud, but of all the ways I had allowed myself to go unseen. And then, without planning it, without a dramatic epiphany, I opened my notebook, the one with recipes written in fading ink, and on the back page, I wrote the phone number for the Postal Inspection Service. I didn't call them, not yet. But writing the number down felt like placing a candle in a dark hallway, illuminating just enough for the next step. I went to bed early that night but couldn't sleep. Instead, I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of my modest house breathing around me, the groan of the pipes, the rustle of the curtains, the faint hum of the refrigerator. And somewhere between midnight and dawn, I understood that the shift in me was not about punishment or revenge. It was about reclaiming something I had misplaced over the years without noticing. My agency, my right to name what had happened to me, my permission. It dawned on me slowly, like the first hint of morning light slipping under the curtains, that the life I had been grieving, the life where my grandson loved me without conditions, had been gone long before the stolen checks, long before the forged signatures, and that accepting this truth did not diminish the love I had once given. It simply released me from the illusion that I still needed to keep giving it. In the morning, I brewed my tea the way I always do, but this time when I sat at the kitchen table, I didn't feel small, and I didn't feel old in the way people use that word to mean powerless. Instead, I felt something loosening in my chest, something that reminded me of who I had been before life demanded so much bending from me. The middle point of change is never loud, never cinematic. It is the moment when you stop waiting for someone to rescue you and realize that you were never as trapped as you believed. And as I sat there sipping slowly from my chipped ceramic mug, I knew with a clarity that felt both frightening and liberating that I was ready, really ready, to begin stepping out of the story someone else had been writing for me and to start writing my own again, sentence by steady sentence. I had told myself that preparing the documents, gathering the evidence, and letting the truth settle inside me was enough for now, that I could rest for a few days before doing anything further. But life has a way of pushing you forward, even when you try to stay still. And the push came not with drama, but with a soft, almost careless cruelty that felt more piercing than anything loud could have been. The phone rang again, 2 mornings later, early enough that the sunlight had barely crept across my living room floor, and without even needing to look at the screen, I knew it was him. Something inside me tightened, not with fear, but with the kind of dread that comes from knowing you can no longer pretend ignorance. I let it ring until it stopped, and then, because some small stubborn part of me wanted to know what story he would tell next, I listened to the voicemail he left. His voice was strained, impatient, trying to sound concerned, but leaking irritation between each syllable, as if my existence were an inconvenience he had hoped would quietly resolve itself. He said he had been meaning to check on me, that he heard from someone I had been at the post office, that there must be some misunderstanding, and he would come by later to sort things out. The way he said sort made my skin prickle. It was the tone of someone rearranging objects, not talking to a person, the tone of a man who thinks authority is his by default. I spent the rest of the morning pacing the house, something I almost never do, because my knees prefer calm, and my nerves usually settle down once I'm busy with small chores. But that day I couldn't bring myself to fold laundry, or wash dishes, or sweep the kitchen floor. I kept hearing his voice in my head, not the grown man he was now, but the child he had been, the one who used to slip his small hand into mine when crossing the street, trusting me to keep him safe. I wondered when the roles had reversed, when he had cast himself as the protector and me as the fragile artifact to be managed, and whether he believed the story he told himself when he justified taking what wasn't his. The mind is a strange thing. It can turn betrayal into duty if you twist it enough times. He showed up in the afternoon, knocking not with hesitation, but with the confidence of someone who believed the door would always open for him. I almost didn't answer, but I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of imagining me frightened, so I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and opened the door just enough for him to see me. He stepped inside without being invited, glancing around as though checking for signs of chaos, perhaps expecting to find bills scattered, dishes undone, or some manufactured evidence of incompetence. When he saw none of it, his jaw tightened slightly, an expression so quick and small that if I hadn't known him since birth, I might have missed it. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had fed him soup when he was sick, and he spoke with a rehearsed calmness that cracked at the edges. He said he had handled my benefits because he thought I'd appreciate the help, that he had changed my address only to make things easier, that he had signed my checks because the system is confusing, and that he had always meant to tell me, but kept forgetting. I listened, saying nothing, letting his words fill the air with their thin self-justification, and as he talked, I felt a kind of numbness settle into me, like frost forming on the surface of water. He insisted that nothing serious had happened, that I was blowing things out of proportion, that it was just money, and that he was practically family. That last phrase nearly made me laugh, because the idea of being practically family to someone who had taken such deliberate advantage of me felt like a bitter joke. When he finally paused, perhaps expecting my forgiveness, I told him in a steady, unshaking voice that I knew everything: the forged signatures, the redirected address, the cashing of checks, the lies told to the postal service. For a brief moment his face went blank, as though the mask he had been wearing slipped off and hit the floor. Then he leaned back in the chair, crossed his arms, and said, "I didn't understand how the world worked anymore, that people my age didn't know what was necessary to get by, that he'd had a rough couple of years and had only taken what he knew I wouldn't miss." The audacity of that sentence, the sheer invading arrogance of it, landed in my chest like a stone. I told him he had no right to decide what I would or would not miss, and he shrugged, as if shrugging could erase 2 years of theft. When he realized I wasn't softening, he shifted tactics, leaning forward, lowering his voice, trying to play the concerned relative. He said reporting anything would cause him real trouble, that it could ruin his future, that the authorities would misinterpret everything, as though forging my name on federal documents were a charming misunderstanding. He begged me not to escalate, and in his desperation there was an ugliness I had never seen in him, a willingness to manipulate my guilt and fear, to weaponize the years I had loved him, to twist them into leverage. But the part of me that used to buckle under guilt had broken open days ago, quietly, irrevocably. I watched him beg and bargain, promising to repay what he borrowed, swearing he would handle everything properly from now on, insisting we could keep it in the family, as though silence were some tender act rather than a continuation of the theft. But the worst moment came when he looked at me, truly looked at me, and said he thought I didn't really need the money, that I hardly used it, that I lived simply, and that it made more sense for someone like him, someone still building a life, to have access to funds that wouldn't make a difference to me. I think that was the moment something deep inside me hardened. It wasn't the theft itself. People steal every day out of greed, desperation, weakness, but the absolute certainty with which he believed my life was worth less than his, that my needs were negligible, that my future was over and his was worth sacrificing mine for. It was the confidence of someone who had never once imagined the elderly as full human beings. It was the erasure of me. When he left, slamming the door as if I had wronged him, the house felt both larger and smaller at once. I sat at the table for nearly an hour, staring at the place where he had rested his hands, and I felt the cold bloom of something like mourning and something like resolve grow side by side inside me. The second escalation wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the understanding that he believed I wouldn't do anything, that I was too old, too dependent, too afraid to take a step he couldn't control. And that belief, more than the theft, more than the lies, more than the audacity, became the fuel of what came next. That evening, while the sky darkened and the wind rattled the loose gutter outside my bedroom window, I gathered the papers again, but this time not with trembling hands or with the dull ache of dread. I placed them in a neat stack, clipped them together, and set them beside the phone. I didn't call the postal inspector yet, but I knew I would. The decision was no longer a question. I felt it in my bones, the same bones that had carried me through more than 8 decades of loving, losing, sacrificing, and enduring. The second escalation was not anger, it was clarity, the kind that arrives only after someone has stripped you of your illusions. And while part of me grieved that it had come from the very person whose small hands I had once guided across the street, another part of me, the part that had gone quiet for too long, finally rose. If you'd like, I can move on to the 6th part whenever you're ready. The morning I finally made the call began in a strange, deliberate stillness, the kind of quiet that settles over a home when something decisive is about to happen, as if even the walls are listening and bracing for a shift they cannot name. And I remember sitting at the edge of my bed with the light just beginning to seep through the blinds, thinking how odd it was that a moment capable of altering an entire lifetime could be born from such small, unremarkable beginnings. I had woken before dawn, not from fear and not from habit, but from an awareness so sharp it felt almost like someone had laid a hand on my shoulder and whispered that the time had come. And for once, I didn't doubt myself or second-guess the impulse. I rose slowly, my joints stiff in the way that comes with age, but my mind unnervingly clear, as if all the fog of the past weeks had burned away during the night, leaving behind only the bare truth of what needed to be done. I made tea, moving through the kitchen with quiet purpose, watching the steam rise from the cup as though it were some kind of offering to an old self I was finally ready to release. And then I sat down at the table and placed the neat stack of documents in front of me, the forged change of address form, the copied signatures, the transaction history, all the silent witnesses to a betrayal that had grown too large to ignore. The phone sat beside them like a patient animal waiting to be summoned, and for a moment I let my fingers rest on it, not trembling as they had before, but steady and resolute. And I realized that everything that had led me to this point, every quiet, humiliation, every dismissed instinct, every small erosion of my dignity, had been preparing me for this decision. I dialed the number with slow precision, listening to each ring stretch through the room like a taut thread, until a voice answered, calm and professional, asking how they could assist me. And when I spoke, I heard a tone in my own voice I hadn't heard in years, a tone without apology, without hesitation, without the tremor of someone afraid to take up space. I explained what had happened, each detail landing like a measured stone. the unauthorized address change, the forged signatures, the 2 years of siphoned benefits, and the man on the other end didn't interrupt me, didn't rush me, didn't imply confusion or doubt. He simply listened, and in that act of being heard, something inside me rose with a quiet strength I had forgotten I possessed. As he asked clarifying questions, practical ones, the kind asked by people who deal with the truth in its rawest form every day, and I answered each one with an almost frightening clarity, as if I had rehearsed this exchange not for hours, but for years. When I gave him my grandson's name, something inside me tightened, not from regret, but from the deep, steady grief of acknowledging that some losses do not come from death, but from moments when a person chooses a version of themselves that no longer includes you. When the inspector said that what I described constituted a federal crime and that they would begin the investigation immediately, I felt no vindictive thrill, no sense of triumph, only a wave of profound relief that washed over me like warm water, softening the last remnants of fear that had clung to me. He told me they would subpoena the records, track the checks, verify the signatures, confirm the forwarding address, and contact everyone involved. And with each item he listed, I felt another weight lift from me, not because he promised justice, but because he promised process, something steady and uncorrupted by family obligation. When the call ended, I sat for a long moment without moving, the silence in the house no longer suffocating, but expansive, as though the walls had finally exhaled after weeks of holding their breath. I realized then that the act itself, the decision to call, the words I'd spoken, was the real turning point, the irreversible threshold crossed, because even if the world suddenly rewound and he showed up at my door with apologies and remorse and explanations, nothing could undo the clarity I had found within myself. I felt taller somehow, though my back remained curved by age, and I felt younger in a way that had nothing to do with my body and everything to do with my spirit, which had finally stood up after being bent for so long. Later that afternoon, when the knock came, sharp, hurried, familiar, I didn't freeze or shrink or hold my breath the way I once would have. I opened the door just enough to see him standing there, his face tight with a mixture of anger, panic, and entitlement, the expression of a man who senses that something he believed he owned is slipping through his fingers. He demanded to know what I had done, his voice louder than it needed to be, vibrating with fear disguised as fury, and I watched him without stepping aside, without offering hospitality or softness or any of the comforts he had long taken for granted. I told him in a tone quiet enough to force him to listen that I had followed the law, that I had told the truth, that whatever happened next was no longer between him and me, but between him and the consequences he had earned. For a moment he stood there speechless, his mouth working but producing no sound, and in that silence I saw the boy he had once been, frightened and stubborn, but I also saw the man he had chosen to become, and the grief of that realization pressed against my ribs, but I didn't waver. When he reached out as if to push past me into the house, I placed my hand on the door and held it firm, and the shock in his eyes at my refusal was almost laughable. When I leaned against the wood for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the finality of it settle into my bones, and for the first time in years, I felt my own heartbeat, not as a reminder of age, but as a reminder of presence, of agency, of survival. The culmination was not loud, not dramatic in the way stories like to be. It was simply the act of reclaiming my place in the world, of naming what had happened to me, of refusing to be erased quietly and conveniently by someone who believed I would. never fight back. And as the evening light slowly filled the room, washing the walls in gold, I realized that what I had gained was not vengeance, but the return of my own voice, a voice that had waited far too long to speak its truth. In the weeks that followed, life did not explode or transform into something unrecognizable, the way stories sometimes promise when a woman finally chooses herself. Instead, it unfolded with a deliberate, almost modest slowness, like a curtain being drawn back inch by inch to reveal a scene that had been there all along, waiting for me to notice it. And I found that this quiet, steady change suited me far more than any grand gesture ever could. The postal inspector called twice to update me, his voice always measured and factual, and each time he spoke of their findings, the traced checks, the surveillance footage from distant ATMs, the matching signatures, the confirmation of the Florida post office box registered under my grandson's name. I listened without interruption, feeling less like a victim being comforted and more like a witness whose testimony mattered. And there was a strange dignity in that, in being treated not as a confused old woman, but as the primary keeper of a truth that would now be entered into official records. He told me that some of the funds would be recoverable, that the system had its mechanisms for righting certain wrongs, though never all of them, and I thanked him not so much for the money, which at my age has already been mostly converted into pills, heat, and modest comforts, but for the affirmation that what was taken from me was real, that I had not imagined the erosion of my life, that the world on paper agreed with the world I carried in my chest. At some point during those weeks, a letter arrived, not from any agency or bank, but from him, the envelope addressed in the same impatient hand that had once scribbled birthday cards and forged my name on government forms. And for a long time, I left it on the edge of the kitchen counter untouched, moving it slightly to wipe crumbs, setting my teacup near it, treating it almost like an object in a familiar still life rather than a message I was obligated to open. When I finally slid my finger under the flap, it was not curiosity that moved me, but a kind of settled acceptance, because by then I already knew that whatever words lay inside could not restore what had been broken. The letter was shorter than I expected, messy and defensive, weaving between apology and accusation, with the clumsiness of someone who has never truly learned how to look at another person without first checking for their own reflection. He said he never meant for it to go this far, that he had only been trying to stay afloat, that he couldn't believe I had involved federal authorities, as if my quiet survival were less important than his shock at being held accountable. And, reading his words, I felt a tenderness so faint it was almost memory, and a sadness so deep it felt like standing at the edge of a well and seeing only my own face reflected in the darkness below. I did not write back, because there are some conversations that would be nothing more than reopening a wound that has finally started to scar, and at my age, I have no time left for bleeding on purpose. Instead, I folded the letter once, then again, and slid it into a folder with all the other documents, not out of sentiment, but out of order, a record of how far a line can be crossed before a woman like me decides that silence is no longer love, but complicity. Day by day, the house began to feel different, not because anything in it had changed, but because I was moving through it in a new way, no longer shrunken around the idea that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention my family tossed in, my direction, but simply present as the rightful owner of my own life. And that ownership showed up in the smallest, quietest acts. I took myself to the market and bought the good bread without calculating who else might want a slice. I refilled my prescriptions on time without worrying whether I was being too expensive for anyone, I sat by the window in the afternoons and read old novels, as if leisure were something I still deserved, and not a privilege reserved for the young and unburdened. And when the mail came, and I saw envelopes with my name and my real address printed clearly on them, I felt a small, private satisfaction every time I turned the key in the box, as if each piece of paper were a tiny salute to my persistence. The first reinstated benefit check that arrived after the investigation made its slow procedural way through the system was not large, certainly not enough to erase the financial harm of 2 stolen years. But when I held it in my hand, I found myself smiling because it was more than money. It was proof that the world now recognized me where it had allowed me to disappear before, that the system which had been used to erase me was now, however imperfectly, bearing witness to my return. I would be lying if I said I never thought of him anymore, that I closed that door and never again pressed my ear against the wood to hear what might still be knocking on the other side, because love does not vanish just because you finally protect yourself from the person who has mishandled it. Instead, it changes shape, growing into something more like weathered compassion, something you can hold without it swallowing you whole. Sometimes, when I pass the little box of photographs I keep on the bookshelf, I pause and let my fingers rest on the lid, feeling both the weight of the boy he was and the distance of the man he became. And there is grief in that, but there is also a strange freedom in knowing that I can honor the child without inviting the adult back into the center of my life. If he calls again, I will let the machine answer, not out of cruelty, but out of alignment with the truth I have learned, that forgiveness does not require reunion, and that self-respect sometimes sounds like a phone that does not get picked up. So my days now are simple and, to someone watching from the outside, probably uneventful, yet inside them there is a depth and a steadiness I did not have back when I was still trying to persuade the world that I mattered as much as anyone else at the table. I brew my tea, I mend small tears in old sweaters. I visit the library and talk too long with the librarian who always sets aside large print mysteries for me. And on Sundays, I walk a little slower down my street, not because I am weaker, but because I finally allow myself to notice the world I am still part of, instead of rushing home to wait by a silent phone. Some evenings, as the sun folds itself behind the houses and the sky turns that soft, forgiving blue, I sit at the table and write small notes to myself on scraps of paper, reminders like you did not imagine it, or your life is still yours, or you are not lucky they tolerate you. They are lucky you ever loved them at all. And I tuck them into recipe books and coat pockets, places I know I will return to on days when the old habits creep back like drafts under the door. If there is anything I would say to another woman who finds herself staring at forged signatures and missing checks and the smiling face of someone who insists she is overreacting, it is this: do not let the years you have lived be used against you as proof that you should endure a little more. Do not let the softness they praised in you become the weapon they use to keep you quiet. And do not believe for even one more hour that choosing yourself is a betrayal of the people who have already betrayed you. You may be 70, 80, 90. Your hair may be thin and your knees unreliable, but your voice, if you let it rise, is still younger than any lie they have told about you. And it is never, never too late to say this happened. It was wrong, and I will not vanish just because it is convenient for someone else if I do. I did not get back the years they spent cashing what was mine in a state I have never seen. I did not get a family healed and restored and grateful for my courage, but I got myself back, and in the quiet of this small house, with the mail once again, finding its way to my real door and my name written where it belongs, I have discovered that sometimes that is not just enough, it is everything.